Um, we're talking today about organic insect control and really thinking about this from the insecticides. In other workshops, we talk about more like pest by pest, what kind of cultural controls or biocontrols you can use. But the purpose of this workshop is to get to know the materials a little bit better so that hopefully you can learn when to use one and not another. So we are talking about pesticides here. So and I'm kind of simplifying things in order to sort of compare the materials with each other, but always check the label before making an application. And different states have different rules about what pesticides can be applied and how. So check your state registration before using things I might be recommending today. And I'm using the trade names just to keep it simple today. And in some cases, there's many different trade names, and I'm just picked one randomly. It doesn't mean that that one is better than the others. So first, I want to say that it's really important to think about the type of insect that you're trying to control when choosing the pesticide. So how is the insect going to interact with this material that you're spraying? So there's different types of feeding behavior. I think mostly what we think about is this chewing damage that maybe caterpillars or beetles often cause. There's also piercing, sucking type insects, so like aphids that I have this mosquito here to sort of drive this point home, but our aphids are an example of piercing, sucking insects. And then there's also this rasping. So here's an example of that. Onion thrips kind of um, rasp the leaf tissue, and then the plant sap comes out, and they suck that up. And then other ways to think about the insects. There's insects that have complete metamorphosis, so they have an egg stage, and the eggs hatch into a larva. And the larvae then pupate and turn into adult that looks totally different than the immature stage. So like caterpillars are a good example of this, beetles and flies. And sometimes the larval stage is underground and the adult is above ground. But all of these have this chewing type of damage in contrast to the true bugs. So things like squash bugs, stink bugs, brown marmorated stink bug, and also aphids and thrips and leafhoppers. And so these have incomplete metamorphosis where the immature stage looks a lot like the adult stage. And often there's eggs, but not always. So they're quite different from, say, a caterpillar. And these true bugs have that piercing, sucking, or rasping, sucking mouth parts. And so this will come in handy as we're thinking about which material to use. And some other questions are, is it soft-bodied or hard-bodied? Is it above ground or below ground? Is the damage to the foliage, or is it also affecting the fruit or in the roots? And also, does it overwinter here? Like something like a cabbage root maggot, where it's pupating right in the soil and emerges from the field where they were in the fall. Or is it migrating in like something like a corn earworm or a potato leaf hopper, where it's just blowing in from somewhere else? Here's a long list of vegetable pests that are kind of broken down into these different groups based on the type of insect and sort of also the way that they feed. So we've got beetles, bugs, caterpillars, and flies. And the adult flies are almost never causing damage that I could think of, except for maybe allium leaf miner, which when the adult fly lays an egg, it makes a wound in the plant that's noticeable. But really, we're talking about flies. We're talking about like leaf miners or cabbage maggot, where the larvae are doing the damage. Okay, so now we're gonna get into talking about the materials. So there's not too many different organic approved insecticides, and I should have thrown up just a list of them to show you that we don't have too many to get through. But the first one here is probably the most widely used because it's effective against a lot of different insects, but it also is probably the most effective material organically. So this is a spinosad, and so it's a neurotoxin, and it has to be ingested to work. So it works mostly on chewing insects. So things like flea beetles, caterpillars, fly larvae, and also thrips works best for those types of pests. It has some residual activity, so it sticks to the leaf and it stays there for a couple of days. And so that's a real benefit for something like flea beetle, where you can kill the beetles that are there right now, but they're going to keep coming and coming. So this residual activity is part of, I think, why Entrust works so well. It does also have some contact activity, so it will kill some of the beetles that just come in contact with it. But also it has some ability to move into the leaf tissue, and so this is really helpful for like leaf miners that are in between layers of cells in the foliage. So that's another nice thing about Entrust. Some insects can develop resistance to Entrust, so we have to be a little bit careful about that. And I would say, yeah, just rotating materials. We're not going to get too much into that today, but it's a good idea to pay attention to the Entrust label, because they do have a lot of restrictions on how many applications per pest per season. And so you'll want to be aware of that.
Sue, there's a
Yep. Thanks.
Emily, there you go.
Yeah, oh, thanks. I was wondering if you had half-life information for these materials.
Yeah, so Pyganic, I don't know the specific exact half-life, but like I was saying with Entrust, it does stick around on the leaf tissue for a couple of days. If you apply Entrust to the soil, it can adhere to the soil particles, and so it has a longer residual or half-life in the soil. And compared to Pyganic breaks down really quickly, like within hours in bright sun. So I'll sort of touch on that as we go through each material, and thanks for pointing that out, that I skipped over it for Entrust. So yeah, so Pyganic, because it has this short period of activity, and it also only works on contact. So this does not have to be ingested by the pest in order to kill it. It's a neurotoxin. When it comes in contact with the insect, it dies. It's very broad spectrum, so if you have beneficial insects out there, those will be susceptible also. So you want to be careful to use Pyganic, like not when there are bees foraging and things like that. But it doesn't stick around in the environment for very long, and so that can be a good thing and a bad thing. But we recommend Pyganic for like a quick knockdown of things like adult beetles that are sort of otherwise hard to kill. It works well on leafhoppers. I think because they're like flying around like crazy, they're easy to knock out with this contact material. And some caterpillars, thrips, and some aphids are also affected. Yeah, let me know if I need to slow down for questions. Azadiractin, there's a lot of words on this slide, but azadiractin is another, it's the active ingredient in neem oil, which is, so neem is a plant that has a lot of different compounds in it that have various degrees of insect killing ability. But azadiractin is the strongest component of that neem oil. And I just mention it because sometimes you see there are a lot of products that contain azadiractin or neem oil, and you'll see both. And so I just want to explain that neem oil will have sort of other stuff also in it from this plant extract, and it might have like, but then the azadiractin is sort of concentrated out of that neem oil, and I think when you get azadiractin products, it has a higher percentage of that active ingredient that we think is doing most of the insect killing. So this one's a little bit different. It's not a toxin, it's an insect growth regulator. So that means that it prevents, like we were talking about the life cycle, it prevents insects from molting from one stage to the next, or getting bigger and growing. So it works on contact and ingestion, and also has some, it deters feeding and egg laying. So that can be sort of sub mode of action. But because of this insect growth regulator mode of action, it's not like killing the insect right away. It's just kind of slowing it down, and eventually it dies. So that's something to take into account if you're using these materials, that they're not gonna, if you spray it today and you go out and check the field tomorrow, you're not gonna see necessarily a bunch of dead insects. But for something, but it tends to work pretty well for the true bugs that don't have that kind of big change from egg to larva to adult, but just kind of go through this more sort of continuous immature stage to adult. So we recommend it a lot for things like aphids, squash bugs, especially the nymphs, those immature squash bugs that are pictured here, and caterpillars. Again, I should say, always with caterpillars, you want to try and spray when the caterpillars are smaller. You want to target the smaller caterpillars, just because they can eat a lot, and the bigger the caterpillar, the more it can eat. So you can, if you can kill the caterpillars while they're small, then you have less damage. So I think that's what I wanted to say about azadiractin. And yeah, there are a bunch of different products: azatin, azatrol, azagard. Some of the neem products are like Neemix, Volt-X, and things like that. I think the next group we'll talk about is oils. So things like Scheufele, that's one OMRI-approved trade name. There are a few others. So this is one where it works just on contact, and what it's doing is just smothering the insects and preventing them from breathing, really. So insects have these breathing tubes all over their bodies, and if you just block them, then they die. This oils work really well for eggs. The eggs are actually having some gas exchange with the environment, so you can kind of suffocate an egg. But that is kind of helpful because there are a lot of pests that, you know, targeting the eggs might make sense. So this is like leaf miner fly eggs, and once the eggs hatch and the leaf miners kind of go in between the layers of the leaf, they're hard to get to. So you can kill the eggs maybe with this oil. And it works well for soft-bodied insects and is recommended often for aphids and mites. And one thing to be aware of is that there is phytotoxicity. So if it's over about 80 degrees Fahrenheit and sunny, then you might want to choose something else. Are there any questions so far that I should?
Someone just asked about insecticidal soap, but I think that's the next slide, right?
Yeah. Yep,
Cool.
it is.
The only question so far.
So, and I should say also the half-life question, Azadiractin, pretty quick, breaks down not as quickly as Pyganic, but it doesn't stick around in the soil or in the environment very long, and same with the oil. And once the oil and also soap dry up, there's no effect on the insects. So insecticidal soap is kind of similar to oil, but where you want to kind of smother the insect, but here it's kind of disrupting the cuticle layer or the membrane. And so, yeah, it works on contact only, and for soft-bodied insects like aphids and mites and whiteflies. So it's used a lot in greenhouses. And we've done some research on cabbage aphid, and it seems like soap is better than oil for cabbage aphid, and we've seen that in a couple of different studies. So the next and last material we're going to talk about is BT. And so this is a toxin that's produced by a bacterium in the soil, naturally occurring. And the cool thing about BT is that they're fairly targeted. So like I was talking about Pyganic earlier, how it's really broad spectrum and will kill any insect that it comes in contact with just about. On the other side of the spectrum is a targeted material, something like BT, where the material is only effective against a small range. In this case, caterpillars. So the bacteria, Bacillus thuringiensis, that's why it's called BT, produces this toxin, and there's different strains of the bacteria that affect different groups of insects. So there's 2 strains, and these are Dipel and Zentari are the trade names here. Oh, I wrote it down right here and then forgot that it was there. Yeah, so Dipel and Zentari are these strains that work just on caterpillars. There are other strains that affect, say, beetles or fly larvae, but currently there's no OMRI listed version of this Tenebrionis beetle material. Some of you might remember that briefly there was like 2 years ago, but it got pulled off the market again. And then there's natural, which works for fly larvae, which is like in a greenhouse setting. I think is where this is mostly used. So practically the ones that we use most in vegetable production are dipel and Zentari, and they're for caterpillars.
Andy just commented it and said Trident will be back in 2021
Sweet.
for potato beetle.
Okay, so that comment is, yeah, so this other strain is really effective, or can be really effective, on Colorado potato beetle larvae. So we'll talk about that in the future when it comes out, but that's exciting. It's always good to have new organic insecticides that work.
Also, hold on, I'm going to try and unmute Andy. Andy, I think you're unmuted now if you want to ask about BT for grubs.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you. Well, I know BT Galleria is another strain of BT that has activity on beetle larvae, and there has been a product out there for control of grubs in lawns, and I think vegetables have been on the label as well. And it, like, one product is called Grub Gone. And my understanding is that they've ramped up production of that a lot. What I don't know is if it's OMRI listed.
Yeah, I don't know the answer to that question. And for those of you that don't know Andy, that was Andy Radin from Rhode Island Extension, good friend and colleague. Thanks for the information.
Hey, while I'm unmuted, I was also going to mention I played with it a number of years ago when it was in a really nasty form to work with, but there's a new formulation of Grandivo, which is a bacterial insecticide, and it has a lot of overlap with control for things that what do you call it, entrust type product control. I've never played with it. I don't know how effective it is. It does have an OMRI label.
Thank you so much for pointing that out. Yeah, there's a whole class of insecticides that I decided, for the sake of keeping the scope of this conversation a little bit smaller, that I was not going to talk about them, but these are biological pesticides. So they are, let's see, they're bacteria or fungi that affect insects. And it's slightly different from this BT because when we're talking about BT, we're really talking about the toxin produced by the bacteria. And with the biopesticides, they're kind of one step removed. They're the actual organism, or sometimes also compounds that the organism makes to kill other insects. But as Andy kind of alluded to, there are a bunch of them. They're really widely labeled, and the efficacy data is highly variable or hard to parse which ones work really well for which insect pests. And I would love to tackle it as kind of its own topic in the future. But if there are specific questions, we can try to answer them. And it's true also that the biopesticides are always being reformulated and concentrated to be more and more effective. And so sometimes I need to remind myself of that, because like we do these research trials and look at these things in the field. Obviously, we're limited in how many of these studies we can do. We can't look at all of the materials for all of the pests that they're labeled for, but sometimes maybe I looked at Grand Evo 6 years ago and wasn't impressed by it, but it is different now and it might be more effective. So it's a good point. Just getting back to BT here. So the ones that are OMRI listed that we usually use in veg production, are dipel and Zentari that work for caterpillars. So you apply them to the foliage and they're ingested by the caterpillars. They have some residual activity. They stick to the leaf and the caterpillars eat them over several days and die. And here is a picture of a dead caterpillar. Ew. So now I'm going to try and just like tie it all together a little bit. So we talked about how the pests differ and how they interact with these things and how they're chewing the plant or sucking the juices. And then we talked about the insecticides and how they work differently. And I'm just going to try and weave it together here quickly before we open it up for questions. So we have beetle pests. So like flea beetles, Colorado potato beetle, striped cucumber beetle. This is Mexican bean beetle. So mostly these things are adults that are chewing on the leaf. And then also the larvae sometimes, in like the case of potato beetle, yeah, the larvae can eat a lot. And bean beetle, same thing, where like flea beetles and striped cucumber beetles, their larvae are feeding on the roots underground, and we don't tend to worry about them very much. Anyway, they're chewing the leaves largely. So the treatments we usually recommend are, and kind of in order of their efficacy, are Entrust, which needs to be ingested and it has this residual on the leaf. So we recommend that for flea beetles that are doing a lot of leaf chewing and keep on coming, and Colorado potato beetle. So Pyganic we recommend for a quick knockdown of adult beetles. So this could be flea beetle and Colorado potato beetle, but also Mexican bean beetle and striped cucumber beetle, which for whatever reason don't seem to be as affected by the Entrust. So lacking better materials for Mexican bean beetle and striped cucumber beetles, Pyganic can help knock down the adults. Another idea is kaolin clay, which I didn't talk about, but it's not really a pesticide. It is clay that just forms a white dust on the leaf surface, and just beetles don't like it. They don't like to have it on their feet. So it just kind of is a repellent. But it can work pretty well to protect seedlings, especially. So some farmers will actually dunk trays of cucurbit seedlings in a bucket of clay. It's called Surround, the trade name. So that's another thing that can help for flea beetles and striped cucumber beetles. Maybe also Colorado potato beetle. And then Azadiractin we would recommend for the larvae of these Mexican bean beetle and Colorado potato beetle, the larvae are hanging out on the leaf, and so they're easy to hit with this material that's going to prevent them from growing. Are there questions about that you can see?
There's no questions in the question box, but if you're able to unmute yourself if you have a question, go ahead. And if you can't unmute yourself and you can raise your hand, you can do that. Oh, Emily asks, if I found a jar of kaolin clay under my sink and mixed it up, would I probably kill my plants, or should I just try, like another kaolin product that's not labeled for, so like not Surround, just clay?
Yeah. Well, I think that my answer is that from our perspective, Surround has a label, and so there are instructions on how to mix it. There are quality controls, so you know there's not other stuff in there. So we don't really recommend just spraying stuff that you find around the house on your crops. Like I think also sometimes people hear insecticidal soap and then want to mix up some dish soap with water and spray that on their plant, and I think you would have some problems there. So, but the Surround is really cheap and you can get a big bag of it, and the trick to it is mixing it up really well. So I'd encourage folks to give it a try. So the next sort of group of pests that we could think about are caterpillars, and there's a bunch of caterpillars that affect brassicas. There's 4 that we have, and they're really hanging out on the leaves, chewing, and also pooping and making a big mess. There's corn caterpillars, and to a lesser extent are feeding on the foliage, but they get inside the ear and do damage in here. And sort of similarly, this squash vine borer is a caterpillar that lays its egg on the outside of the vine, and then the caterpillar grows inside the vine. So in these cases, the caterpillars are protected from a pesticide spray, and so when you're spraying for these things, you have to target the eggs or the hatching eggs. So I just want to mention that. But here are some of our vegetable pests: cabbage worms, European corn borer, squash vine borer, causing this chewing damage. And our best treatments for caterpillars are, the Dipel, this targeted Bt toxin, but also Entrust works well because, again, it's ingested, and that's another good option. And the last group is the true bugs, aphids and true bugs, and we have a lot of pests in this group, leaf hoppers also, and apart from they can cause damage in a lot of other ways, not just like directly, not as straightforward as chewing on the plant, but they can cause deformities of the growing points when they get in there. They're a contaminant, they spread disease, so lots of reasons to try and control them. And something we often recommend for this group is a mix of Azadiractin and Pyganic. So here you have the slowing down the growth effect of the Azadiractin plus the contact killing of the Pyganic, and that seems to work pretty well for things like leaf hoppers and squash bug nymphs. We also recommend this sometimes for the second generation of potato beetle. Potato beetles develop resistance to insecticides fairly quickly, and so when growers are just using Entrust, they will develop resistance to that. And so if you look on the Entrust label, there's a lot of restrictions about using it for a potato beetle, and you can't apply it on both generations and da 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 da. Anyway, so we're always looking for things for this second generation of potato beetle, and this is one that we recommend. For aphids, we recommend maybe also this Azadiractin or Pyganic, but also the oils and soaps are good. And for thrips, we usually recommend Entrust. And here they kind of are all next to each other. Whoa, this looks crazy. Complicated table. So don't try to, it's actually available in this handouts tab as a PDF if you want to save a copy for yourself, print it out, keep it in your pesticide shed. We welcome you to do that. But yeah, it's got the pesticides. Oops, sorry. the pesticides, the target pests, and a few notes about how to apply it best, or if there are any restrictions or anything like that. So I'll leave this up here, and that's the end of my presentation. So we have plenty of time for questions, comments, and discussion. And I will stop talking now.
I have a question.
Go ahead.
That's about shelf life. How long these products are good for, not in the field, but in storage, both particularly Entrust and Pyganic.
Yeah, that's a good question. The sort of rule of thumb is 2 years, and that should be good for Entrust and Pyganic, and the oils and soaps and the Azadiractin. Some of the biological pesticides that we didn't really talk about today that are like fungi or bacteria, those might need to be stored in a cold, dark place, and they might, you know, if they get wet, they're a little more finicky about storage. There is a storage section on the label for every pesticide that gives recommendations for, like, yeah, some things want to be kept cold and others it doesn't matter as much. So just check the label, I would say also.
Thank you.
But otherwise, 2 years. There was one question that came in ahead of time about spotted wing predators. And I wish that, or maybe someone from the fruit team is here, but I don't know a ton about predators, insect predators of spotted wing Drosophila. I will say that we worked with at least one farm on hummingbirds, using hummingbird feeders to attract hummingbirds to the field, and they feed on fruit flies. So that's one predator, not an insect predator, but a bird predator. So that's all I could think about that. I think that was Dan. I don't know if he's still here. That answers the question.
Sue, do you know if any of these products can be tank mixed together? So one to kind of, if you mix Pyganic for a knockdown and then put in another product to try to give some protection for the next few days, since you have potential larvae hatching?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think tank mixing is a good idea. And some cases we've recommended that here, like mixing Pyganic and Azadiractin, but Ruth had studied a bunch different materials for flea beetles and found that mixing Entrust and Pyganic can improve the efficacy. So with the flea beetles and brassicas, sometimes the numbers are just so high that the Pyganic can help kind of wipe out a certain number, and then it's kind of like asking less of the Entrust. So they kind of help each other out in that way. Other common mixes are mixing insecticidal soap with Pyganic or Azadiractin for aphid control. That would be a common one. When you start mixing, if you start mixing like disease control things, I'm just thinking of like copper might be, or like an oxidate. Those are things that might have an effect on either like the spray solution or an effect on the actual insecticide itself. And again, I would say consult the label there, because often there are, if there are known interactions, they'll often be on the label. Another thing that you might mix together is like dipel and entrust. Like if you have flea beetles and caterpillars, you could spray both together. Andy added that mixing insecticidal soap into other sprays can increase the control of soft-bodied insects like aphids or something, but it also can act as a spreader sticker, which is something I didn't really talk about, but it can be really important, especially for like whenever you're spraying brassicas or onions, we always recommend to include a spreader sticker so that the material doesn't just wash right off that waxy leaf. With entrust, a spreader sticker or oil can help increase that penetration of the material into the leaf. So like if you have leaf miner in spinach or beets, a great program would be, okay, scouting, so that you know when the eggs are there and you can target the eggs and the hatching larvae, and then spraying a mix of entrust and an oil. Because remember, the oil smothers the eggs, and entrust works on fly larvae and has a little bit of like translaminar getting into the leaf, but the oil will also help the entrust get further into the leaf. So that might be a good mix for leaf miners. Any other questions? You know, it can be hard to have a discussion remotely. We have a pretty small group today, so don't be shy if you want to ask something. And it could be about, you know, a different topic. If you have other concerns you want to bring up, we're able to do that also.
Hi.
Also, if you're seeing pests out there, we're not able to be in the field as much as a normal year, so we're hungry for pest alerts. Sorry, someone just spoke. Go right ahead.
Oh, hi. This is Emily Superior. One year in my home garden, as opposed to the farm I was working at, had a really terrible time with aphids on my snap peas. And I know any of us can have a bad time with any pest or disease for any number of reasons on any crop. But comparing notes with other people, I didn't find that they were having particular trouble. And the only variable that I found that was very different was that I found that I started them a little late. Is it possible that starting the crop, in that case peas, late in the season gave the aphids too much of a breeding ground, or is there anything that jumps out at you about that?
Sorry, let me see if I can repeat the
Sorry, that was
question.
a lot of words.
Right. So the question was aphids on peas, and you had planted them later than you normally would, and they had more aphids.
Yeah, they were just totally covered, and still a very new farm. I would say fairly avid gardener, but new farmer. But I still haven't seen that many aphids on snap peas in my gardening or farming life since or before then.
Yeah, so aphid outbreaks could be caused by a couple of different things, and it maybe depends on what species of aphid it is. But some ideas are if you were planting the peas somewhere where you had overwintered greens, they can kind of hang out. We see a lot of aphids in like spinach in the winter, and so then if you put the peas there, they can sort of move right in. Otherwise, sometimes maybe in the early season, this is less of a problem usually, but that if there's aphids that are concentrated on a certain host and then that host disappears, like it gets harvested, or if it's a field that gets mowed, all those aphids move really quickly can move really quickly into a field. So that's another.
It's a brand new tilled area, so maybe that was it.
Maybe, yeah, it's hard to say for sure, but again, with the aphids, some of the oils and soaps can be good at kind of knocking them down.
Thank you
And
so much.
also, like once they start growing, if they're outside, aphids have a lot of natural predators. So like ladybugs and other things usually control aphids in the field, and they're mostly a problem in like a protected greenhouse or high tunnel. Or if there's some of these specialist aphids, like cabbage aphids are a problem in the field. Anyway, so there's some ideas.
Thank
I
you.
think there were some other questions, maybe.
Yes, Jim Ward was asking about mixing sugar in with different products to stimulate eating.
So I know sugar is sometimes recommended to use for fruit flies like spotted wing Drosophila. You mix sugar in the tank with the insecticide to attract the fruit flies to feed on it. I have not heard it recommended for any other insect, and so for the vegetable aphids, or sorry, for the vegetable pest site, I'm not aware of it being necessary or beneficial. Any other questions? So I mentioned that the this table is available as a handout in your little taskbar. You should see there's the OMRI-approved insecticide recommendations, and you should be able to download that. There's also the pest scouting calendar that we talked about last time, where we have kind of gone through week by week through the season and figured out approximately when we first see different pests. And if you haven't got a copy of that, it's here in the handouts, but it's also available on our website, which is ag.umass.edu/vegetable. And there's a bunch of scouting resources up there. There's a scouting resources tab, and you can find scouting sheets and the calendar there. All right, thanks everybody, and we'll hope to see a lot of you next time.